Happy Saturday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Today, of course, is the weekend, so it will be a very foreign policy and ideology-focused episode. At the end of today's video, too, we also need to touch on the economy. Like I normally say on the weekend, it's normally more of a core China Update audience, so we can afford to do a bit of a deeper dive into what many may perceive as quite dry subjects, but are still very important to cover. If you enjoy the episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing are big helps for the channel, and for anyone who can go the extra mile and help me keep China Update financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links in the description below. Like I said, this keeps the channel financially sustainable and primarily subscriber supported. Now, without any further ado, let's jump in. And we begin with developments in Sino-Russian relations. This week, after 12 hours of meetings with US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, which we covered earlier in the week, Foreign Minister and top PRC diplomat Wang Yi traveled to Russia for 2 days of meetings, which included talks with Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov and leader Vladimir Putin. According to a state-run Xinhua report on the Lavrov meeting, Wang Yi touched on many of the themes which we have seen in previous exchanges, most notably the emphasis on building an alternative global order, which the Sino-Russian leaders argue is more democratic and representative of the so-called Global South. We'll be discussing Beijing's evolving ideology and policy related to the Global South later in today's video. General anti-Western themes and rhetoric about historic turning points, etc. were prominent in the official statements too. The Xinhua readout of Wang's meeting with Lavrov, for example, reads, quote, China and Russia should follow the progressive tide of the times, demonstrate the responsibility of major powers, fulfill their international obligations, and through continued strategic collaboration, uphold genuine multilateralism, advance the process of world multipolarity, and promote global governance in a more fair and reasonable direction. End quote. Commentators point out that this is, unsurprisingly, very similar to Xi's comments to Putin in their video chat in December of last year, suggesting that Beijing's policy towards Moscow and Xi's attitude towards Putin specifically remains unchanged. We remember at the time, Xi Jinping expressed, quote, China stands ready to join hands with Russia and all other progressive forces around the world to oppose hegemony and power politics, to reject any unilateralism, protectionism, and bullying, firmly safeguard the sovereignty, security, and development interests of the two countries, and uphold international fairness and justice. End quote. Both Russian and Chinese state media expressed that Lavrov, quote, shared his views on the Ukraine crisis, applauded China's position paper for accommodating the security concerns of all parties and being conducive to eliminating the root causes of the conflict. End quote. The Russian foreign minister said in a telegraph statement after the Moscow talks that, quote, the closeness of the positions of the parties regarding US actions in the international arena, including those of anti-Russian and anti-Chinese nature, was noted. End quote. Wang Yi also met with leader Putin, who formally confirmed reports that he would be traveling to Beijing in October next month to meet with General Secretary Xi Jinping and attend a special conference on the Belt and Road Initiative, a project which the Russian leader expressed allowed the two sides to, quote, integrate our ideas of creating a larger Eurasian space, end quote. According to the official readouts of the meeting, Putin said that, quote, the current international situation fully confirms President Xi Jinping's strategic judgment on the changes that haven't been seen in a century. End quote. And sort of on that theme, we segue now into part 2 of today's video. This week, state media has been pushing hard the theme of the rise of the Global South and the so-called ongoing change of the international or in the international order. For today, let's take some time to unpack some of this ideology behind these concepts in order to better understand Beijing's elite worldview and likely policy directions. We recently covered the publication of the so-called Proposal of the People's Republic of China on the reform and development of global governance on the 13th of September by the Foreign Ministry. We remember that the document, which puts forward Beijing's vision for its own global order, which not only contains familiar and frankly self-serving themes, but also leaned heavily into the concept that China is a leader of the developing world, which was once euphemistically called the Third World and is now euphemistically called the Global South. In the Global Governance Proposal, in the name of redressing historical injustices, China calls for developing countries to be given a much greater say at the United Nations, including seats for Africa on an expanded Security Council. Indeed, it does appear that China has launched a new concerted campaign to present itself as a natural leader for the developing world, seeking to leverage the painful memories, whether real or imagined, that some countries harbour towards the West. Let us now examine how this ideology and policy is being discussed and presented in Beijing. Our purposes here are not to engage in refutation, though we do note several arguable vulnerabilities within this ideological framework, namely 1. China's own mixed record in its support and treatment of the developing world, 2. Arguable hypocrisy due to China's own legacy of imperialism and Han colonization, and perhaps one of the most problematic issues, 3. India, the largest developing country in the world now by population, and a geopolitical rival of China, is conspicuously absent from the proposal on the Reform of Development of Global Governance document submitted by the Chinese side. Now let us move through some of Beijing's rhetoric with authoritative statements made this week across top state media outlets. Quote, "Opposition to injustice and unreasonableness has always been raised by developing countries, but now these calls are particularly confident. Whether it's the Middle East reconciliation wave, the expansion of the BRICS cooperation mechanism, or the unprecedented unity of developing countries in recent multilateral meetings, one gets a genuine feeling that the world has truly changed." End quote. And, quote, "The Group of 77 and China Summit was recently held in Havana. China joined hands with a vast majority of developing countries to uphold the banner of development. The world is currently undergoing major changes unseen in a century. The power of developing countries is continuously growing. As the world's largest developing country," again, India may argue this point, "and a natural member of the Global South, China has always breathed together and shared a common destiny with the vast majority of developing countries. Against the backdrop of global turbulence and increasing uncertainties, China is committed to joining hands with all parties to build a community of shared future for the Global South." End quote. And, quote, "Including China, the Global South countries genuinely hope to uphold justice and promote global governance reform in a more just and reasonable direction. From releasing the document on the Ukraine crisis to initiating and promoting the expansion of the BRICS cooperation mechanism and being the first to express support for the African Union's inclusion in the G20, China has always spoken and acted justly in the international community." End quote. And of course, the state-run Global Times was more aggressive in its rhetoric. Quote, "US President Joe Biden has once again turned the United Nations General Assembly into a runway for touting US leadership. He has used the Ukraine crisis as a weapon to attack other countries at the meeting, whilst also covering up his cliché, hollow proposals for the Global South's development, revealing the fact that the US has little interest in Global South affairs." End quote. And next up, and to end today's video, we examine recent comments made this week by Rhodian Group's Logan Wright, a respected expert on China's financial system. Speaking to US-based outlet The Wire China, Wright argues that while China presents the US-led West with many policy challenges and opportunities, many Western capitals fundamentally misunderstand China's economic growth trends, and this muddies the policy debate environment. Indeed, we remember that Wright recently made similar arguments at a US congressional hearing, which was called China's Financial and Economic Challenges, At the hearing, Wright argued that the severity of China's ongoing economic weakness is still widely underappreciated, and that the United States, quote, no longer faces a growth challenge from China, end quote. We end today's video with Wright's comments to the Wire China, which we are now quoting directly. The more interesting thing from our perspective is that for the United States, none of the challenges that China poses are likely to be impacted by China's relative growth rate. In other words, whether China's GDP is 75% of US GDP or 105% does not really make a difference in terms of how policymakers should think about the economic challenges that China faces. Nor does it suggest that fundamental adjustments in US policy are necessary. China is not going to reach 150% or 200% of US GDP. That won't happen. It is impossible. That's not fully internalized in the debate around China, not only in Washington, D.C., but in other global capitals. That is what the structural slowdown really means. It means that the calls for fundamental changes to policies to counter fundamental threats are going to look less and less critical as China continues to slow, and as China looks more reactive than proactive in shaping the narrative about their economy. Here ends the direct quote. If Wright is indeed correct, this will have many implications, including the effectiveness of its push to leverage relationships with the Global South, which we just covered, and its relationship and competition with the US-led West. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a great Saturday, have a lovely and relaxing weekend, and I will see you all back here for more China Update on Monday.